and thank all of you for coming in and testifying. I have not been along the coastline. I haven't seen the devastation, so I'd just like to ask some basic questions about that. How much of the damage was within what proximity of the shoreline? I mean, can you kind of give me some indication?
Senator, most of the damages that occurred fell within the 100-year floodplain area. So in some cases, the damages were within blocks. In some cases, it was almost a half a mile to a mile, depending upon where you were at. Again, you got to remember in this coastline, you have barrier islands and you have inlets, and then you have rivers that flooded upstream. So most of the damage occurred within the first half miles, generally where you saw the concentrated damage. But because of the coastline and the shore, some of the water was going into places that may have bypassed higher ground and impacted further upstream, particularly on the Hudson River. There was flooding well away from the shore area on the riverbanks where it had moved up the river.
But it would be safe to say that 80–90% of the damage occurred within the 100-year floodplain?
The bulk of it did, although we did identify that, in particularly New Jersey, which had not had updated maps, there was flooding outside of that. This is part of the updated maps showing us better resolution of what could happen. But it's also important to note that the 100-year floodplain only shows the risk as a 1%. In many areas, the flooding was greater than that based upon localized impacts of the storm. And in a stronger hurricane, the 100-year floodplain would not identify all of the risk. And that's one of the things Secretary Donovan and I and others are working on with the Corps of Engineers, is to make good decisions on critical infrastructure, not just based upon the 100-year flood events, but also what the potential storm impacts could be.
Senator, if I could just to clarify one point there, and to give Craig and his team some real credit, one of the most important steps that we've taken, and the task forces work closely with Craig's team on this, is to update those flood maps with new advisory maps. And so just to be clear, there are places where the 100-year floodplain has gone up by more than 10 feet in places within the region. So when I think when you describe the 100-year floodplain, it is within that newer version of it. Compared to the old maps, it was substantially outside in many places, that original. And I think one of the most important things that Craig has done is to accelerate that process of getting those new flood maps out, so that now as towns, particularly along the shore, are rebuilding, they're using more accurate measures of what that 100-year floodplain is, which in some cases is dramatically different from what it was.
Which leads me to my next question. Give me the effect of having a 100-year floodplain map. I mean, in terms of laws, in terms of insurance rules. I mean, tell me what the 100-year floodplain actually does in terms of mitigation, in terms of insurance costs, in terms of what responsible individuals should do in response to 100-year flood maps.
Where we have the updated maps and the community adopts them, the requirements to participate in the flood insurance program is they have to adopt the maps as ordinances, and then they have to drive all of their construction based upon those maps as far as elevation requirements in areas where they are prohibited to build certain types of structures or use certain construction techniques. The most common one for residential areas is the requirement to build 1 foot above base flood elevation. We saw numerous homes along the where I was at in Connecticut that had flooding during Irene, that in rebuilding had been elevated. Those homes are standing. Homes next to them that were not elevated to the new data were destroyed. It oftentimes means the difference between communities being able to rapidly recover and people come home after a cleanup and restoration of power versus losing everything, including the community's tax base. So while it does not factor in the worst possible scenarios, that there could still be damages, by and large across the Gulf Coast and now across the Northeast where these standards have been applied, storms that have hit show that, by and large, the elevation requirements preserves housing, tax base, and homes for people to return to after the storm. Those that are not built to that level oftentimes are those that are destroyed, causing not only the loss of the home, but the loss of the tax base.
Okay, so that really applies to the building codes. What about in terms of the insurance markets, their ability to access insurance, the cost of insurance?
Well, the cost of insurance for flood insurance, again, is provided by the flood insurance program. And if you're not elevated above that base flood, based upon the latest reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program, going to an actuarially based rate is going to be a very expensive proposition to people. If they will build 1 foot above that base flood elevation, they will get a discounted rate showing the reduced risk. But moving towards a more actuarially sound basis is going to price many people to the point where they will have to make hard decisions about either elevation or not being able to rebuild based upon their insurance rates.
What is the, do you have any estimate so far of how much of the cost of the disaster is going to be borne by private insurance versus state governments versus federal governments? Do you have some sort of breakdown on that?
No, sir. Given that almost all of the flood damage will be covered by the flood insurance programs of federal, and commercial industry does not choose to write flood insurance for homeowners, I think the preponderance of the cost will be borne by the taxpayer and through the ratepayers in the flood insurance program. Those damages outside of that, primarily wind damage or those commercial entities that had insurance, those would be the numbers that would be done by the private sector.
If I could add, Senator, one of the critical things about what Craig has said, historically, we have not had a coordinated response across the federal government where we're using the same standards. And so typically what you have is that the official flood maps, in this case, this would be the old flood maps for New Jersey and New York, would govern the investments that we would make post-disaster. What we are doing is trying to use these new maps, so the task force is working on this, to ensure not just FEMA is using the latest information on the maps, but that across the federal government, we're doing that. So for example, in our first community development block grant notice, we required that anytime, as FEMA does, you're rebuilding more than 50% of the cost of the home, you have to use these new maps, even if they're not going to be sort of official for the flood program within 2 years. We also, for example, are looking at, you mentioned insurance, FHA provides insurance on lending. That's another area that we're looking at to try to set a consistent standard so that even though we have this new information, we're not rebuilding to an old standard that will ultimately cost us more, particularly where there are major investments being made by either private entities, private insurers, or by the federal or local government.
Okay, well, I'm out of time, but I'll give you my hint in terms of my follow-up, is I'm going to want to be talking about the moral hazard of insurance pricing and how we basically just incentivize people to continue to build in areas that are going to get wiped out once again, and then the American taxpayer on the hook on that. So that'll be my next line of questioning. Thanks.